we spent the last couple of weeks in complete distress. Today, we work on different countries and different subjects, but today our hearts and thoughts are with the people of Ukraine, as well as those people in Russia and Belarus who oppose the senseless and unprovoked war. And as we think of practical ways of supporting them, and this is probably the main challenge that our discipline is slowly going to rise to. The Jordan Center will be continuing its regular programming, and continue its regular mission of providing high quality information about the region, which I think current events prove all the more important. We hope you will be joining us, although we understand that the shadow of war that Putin has cast over all of us may make it a difficult time to participate. And so, I just sadly on this note that I would really, that I'm very, very happy to welcome our speaker for today. Artemy Kalinovsky is a professor of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet studies at Temple University. He earned his bachelor's degree from George Washington University and his postgraduate degrees from the London School of Economics, after which he spent a decade teaching at the University of Amsterdam. He's one of the premier historians of Central Asia. His first book was Along Goodbye, the Soviet Withdrawal from Afghanistan, which came out of Harvard University Press in 2011. His second book, The Fantastic Laboratory of Social Development, Global Politics and Decolonization in Soviet Tajikistan, came out in 2018 from Colonial and won the Davis and the Hewitt Prize, as well as getting fantastic reviews. He's currently working on a project that studies the legacies of social development in contemporary Central Asia, to examine entanglements between socialist and capitalist development approaches in the late 20th century. And his talk today, which is drawn from this new project, is called Developmentalism and Informal Knowledge. Maybe the title will slightly change: Development, Power, and Informal Knowledge. Thank you, Artemy, for coming.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Rosen and to Alexander for organizing this. This is only my second in-person talk since 2019. And it is a real pleasure and an honor to be here, despite everything that is going on. And of course, writing this paper while following 5 different news timelines has been challenging, but nevertheless, I hope I've come up with something that'll maybe give us something to think about and talk about. I guess, like quite a lot of people, I sort of got into sourdough bread baking during the pandemic, and I realized that in many ways the way that this is probably not unique to me, but the way that my projects and papers develop is very much kind of like the way you use sourdough starter, right? You have this big thing and then you use a little bit of it to start something else. And so the kind of material I'm presenting today actually begins with an archival document that I've had for years and have even cited in previous work. But the rest of it is new, don't worry. So at a 1981 meeting of economists and planners preparing a plan for the social economic development of Central Asia for the period up to the year 2000, very optimistic people back in the early 1980s, the sociologist Dmitry Isakovich Zuzin, a senior researcher at the Research Institute of Labor, pointed out that his visual observations during a tour of the region suggested that the quality of life in the rural regions of Central Asia was better than in the cities, because people benefited from their personal plots and other income that was not registered in official statistics. He also said that life in the countryside entailed a return to patriarchal traditions, but he didn't have any statistics to back this up because, quote, such research cannot be signified in numbers. Still, he said those are observations that are important for drawing certain conclusions. And I always wondered what in the world he was talking about, like what these visual observations were and how he was going to formalize them. Anyway, a few years after this meeting took place, a younger Uzbek sociologist working as part of a large team studying conditions in the local countryside found himself forced to spend the night at a collective farm where he was collecting survey data. And with the day's work finished, his host, a farm chairman, invited him to a heavily laden table with copious amounts of vodka. And it was while consuming the vodka that the chairman explained how things really worked on the farm, how peasants divided time between the common lands and their own plots, how the farm management redistributed resources to those peasants, and how the profit from the agricultural produce grown on those plots found its way back to the farm and presumably back to the farm management. In what follows, I want to suggest that the two episodes and others like them point to what appeared by the 80s to be an intractable problem for Soviet scholars and planners. Their social and economic planning goals required increasingly detailed information about the way people lived, the incomes they earned, the things they bought and wanted to buy, their decision-making regarding schooling, employment, mobility, and so on. But in Central Asia in particular, the quantitative data collected by statisticians and sociologists seemed at odds with the behavior of the population. As Susan pointed out in the 81 meeting, salaries in Central Asian cities were higher, and yet people were moving out of the cities and not into them. As the second episode demonstrates, the attempt to get more detailed information or use more sophisticated computational techniques were often of little assistance, but a well-placed researcher could supplement quantitative research informally, either by using powers of observation, as Zuzin apparently did, or by getting people to open up once the formal part of the research was done. The insights gained from such observation were difficult to translate into formalized research findings, let alone into proposals for planning bodies to consider. Yet over time, such findings did end up translating into a paradigm shift in how the state approached labor and living standards in the Central Asian countryside. So to try to make sense of this, I start with Bernard Cohn's account of the relationship between knowledge and power in colonial India. For those of you who don't know Bernard Cohn's work, he's also the author of this great essay on anthropology and history, which above all else is also very funny, right? An anthropologist's observation of historians' behavior in the archives. But in his kind of, I guess, best known work, he traces the effort of British administrators and scholars to systematize knowledge about India through different, what he calls investigative modalities, such as historiography, language, and law. Perhaps most relevant for this case is what he called the enumerative modality, or the attempt to quantify Indian society through census operations, which created, quote, social categories by which India was ruled for administrative purposes, but also, quote, objectified social, cultural, and linguistic differences among the peoples of India. So for Cohn, the systematization of indigenous forms of knowledge, as well as knowledge about the colony, stripped these concepts and ways of knowledge of the nuance and flexibility that characterized the way these worked within the societies themselves. But although the abstraction of knowledge might limit what colonial officials understood about the societies they wished to govern, the exercise was nonetheless successful as a tool of power. The coding of history, language, and law in such a way made society more open for colonization. Along the way, local intermediaries, so crucial to the initial gathering information, were discarded, seen as too undisciplined in their knowledge to be of much use to an enlightened European scholar or colonial administrator. In a recent book, the sociologist Begum Adlet, who, if I'm not mistaken, did her PhD here, explored the role of survey research within larger modernization campaigns in Turkey of the 50s and 60s. By studying the administration of surveys meant to gauge the progression of individuals on the path to modernization, Adlet shows how the attitude of respondents became a stand-in for their suitability as modern subjects in the eyes of Turkish modernizers and, of course, administrators of these surveys like the sociologist Daniel Lerner. Adelaide writes, quote, studies conducted to measure and record the attitudes of peasants, students, and administrators were intended to be performative. The interviews were designed to occasion the form of subjectivity and interpersonal relations articulated and idealized by modernization theory. Despite researchers' interest in the very activity of survey taking as a modernizing edifice, instances of evasion and refusals to answer using the pre-designated categories prevailed, attesting the capacity for each survey to outstrip the intentions of its coders, sponsors, and creators. It's a brilliant book, by the way, if anybody hasn't come across it. As I said, here I'm going to talk about how Soviet social science, in the service of state planning, tried to make sense of a very particular problem, the failure of Central Asians to leave the countryside and move to the city, despite the fact that industrial salaries were in principle much higher than farm incomes and the possibility for consumption greater in cities. I'm going to trace the way that Soviet sociology and economics evolved to tackle such questions, and then how they seem to come up against the limits in the case of Central Asia. Namely, the increasingly sophisticated survey methodology used to measure incomes and livelihoods failed to explain this phenomenon that baffled planners. And instead, it was the more casual observations, sometimes gathered in informal settings, that seemed to provide the answer that planners and scientists were looking for. Eventually, the idea that Central Asian peasants failed to move because they were better off in the countryside, where their income from personal plots was better than they would get in the city, became part of a new consensus. Central Asian peasants proved to be a poor fit for Soviet categories, undermining the claims of Soviet universal historical progress. At the same time, in the late Soviet period, these practices suggested a way out of the USSR's economic problems, especially in the field of agriculture. In other words, failure to fit into Soviet surveys is what marked these people out as not modern, but then simultaneously as potentially good capitalists. And the consequences of this were not limited to the policy in the late Soviet era, but also affected both post-Soviet paths of reform, which I won't get much into today, but the way social science itself was practiced in the Soviet era and then afterwards. What we see in the case I've described is the inverse of the processes described by Cohn and Adelaide. Increasingly complex and technologically advanced tools of Soviet economic sociology did not translate to greater state power. On the contrary, they ended up revealing the limits of these social sciences and ultimately of Soviet economic management as well. And the story doesn't end there. When international development organizations came in with their own agendas after 1991 and tried to make sense of a region that was largely new to them, they relied on many of the same people who'd been doing sociological work for the Soviet Union. And their ability to provide this kind of informal knowledge was part of the social capital they could use to adjust to the new era. So, as most of you probably know, sociology was a kind of semi-marginalized field for much of Soviet history, although it had a kind of revival in the 1950s, significantly behind related field like economics. The flagship kind of journal didn't start publishing until 1974. And most people who were working as sociologists were not actually officially trained as sociologists until very late in the Soviet period. And it had an even smaller footprint outside of Moscow. In the region I study in Central Asia, all the republics had well-established institutes of economics in the post-war period, certainly by the 1960s, led and for the most part staffed by cadres, from the titular nationality, but none had an institute of sociology, and most would not get one before the end of the Soviet era. Of course, planners had borrowed tools from sociology throughout the Stalin era and beyond to make sense of how the Soviet population lived, worked, and spent their free time. They used these to study leisure and family responsibilities and so on. And they could carry out this research with the help of party organs, local newspapers, and industrial management. But as the problems that such research was meant to address became more complex, economists themselves began to undertake the kind of research meant to reveal why their models didn't work. So the category of kind of economist and sociologist was quite fluid in this period. And perhaps the most famous kind of case of somebody who tried to define themselves as an economist sociologist was Tatyana Zaslavskaya. Both of her graduate degrees were in economics, although she would later become known primarily as a sociologist. She worked under the agrarian economist V.G. Bencher and then came to the Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk, working under Abela Gabanyan. And her early work, she's I think best known for her role during the Perestroika era. She became known as the forewoman of Perestroika for kind of how visible she was and so on. But a lot of her early work was actually studying collective farms in the Euro region. And one of her early findings was that the Khrushchev-era policy of restricting personal plots that peasants could keep was actually very counterproductive. Not only did the private plots, in her words, play an important role in the standard of living of the farmers themselves and the reproduction of farm labor, but also that the collective farm and private plots were inextricably linked. She was also interested in, and this is something that drove authorities' interest in her work, the problem of migration. Except in her case, the problem was that, as in much of Russia and Ukraine, peasants were leaving the farms to an extent that seemed unsustainable. So her studies led her to develop a method which she called the complex study of the village, which would take into account not only individual social problems, but all aspects of village life. As she put it, the previous research on rural urban migration had showed that the phenomenon had, quote, was exceptionally multidimensional and touched upon almost every aspect of the social life of the village. So her kind of research project going forward required a thorough understanding of villages' internal structure and external ties. And her group identified 7 subsystems within the village, including collective production, personal plots, the family, education, natural environment, consumption, spiritual life, and rest. And these subsystems were all interconnected and mutually supporting and had to be understood within the primary area of activity and as part of the system as a whole. In practical terms, what she and her team did was combine survey work, interviews, and statistics drawn from government sources. In 1967, they developed a survey form for village families with 100 questions addressed to different members of the family. 5 years later, they refined their approach by eliminating some questions and conducting separate surveys of families and individual workers and refining questions concerning family income. Here's one page out of what's actually, a kind of 50-page survey with very detailed instructions for the interviewer. Crucially, this method involved mapping out the structures and substructures of the village before starting research, then reevaluating those over the course of the project. Now, in Central Asia, we see a flurry of works appear in the 1970s and early 80s, surveying the attitudes of rural young people to understand why they chose to stay in the village, what might entice them to move to the cities. Often working with large teams of assistants and the logistical support of local party organs and farm management, economists, these are people who are officially economists, surveyed young people using questionnaires that asked them about preferences, about where to live, their own village, Republican capital, medium-sized city, the kind of work they would like to do, the number of children they would like to have, and so on. They also try to get the motivation. Why did they want to stay put? And such studies seem to show that young people from rural families put a premium on having large families and living closer to their parents. Now, for some scholars, this was evidence that the reasons Central Asians stayed on the farm were primarily cultural. If relative earnings appeared to be higher in the city and people would prefer to stay in the countryside, the explanation could not be found in the realm of material interests. The economist and academician Tigran Khachaturov explained at a meeting in 1969 that Central Asia needed special attention, not from economists, but from ethnographers, because they're, quote, they have not rid themselves of the remnants of Sharia or of pre-capitalist relations, and where they are still particular relations of production. In a way, he was saying, well, they don't fit my models, so let somebody else study them. For some of the scholars who carried out surveys in the 60s, in the 70s and early 80s, the data seemed to confirm Khachaturov's offhand remark, although their reading tended to be more careful and nuanced than what he offered. Others were more skeptical, that there were no material explanations for the unwillingness of Central Asians to move into industry. And among them was Dmitry Isakovich Zuzin. I should say, I've sort of lived with this guy now for a long time because I've been aware of him and I've come come across his name in the archives. For a long time, I only knew him as D.I. Zuzin. Then eventually, I found out his name, and then in 1986, this journal starts publishing the photographs of its contributors. And in what I think may be one of the last articles he published, I finally got a picture. So I was very excited about this. Anyway, he ran a project in Central Asia between 1978 and 1980, surveying over 8,000 individuals in Uzbekistan and almost 4,000 in Turkmenistan, as well as 295 local experts, including party workers, managers, and specialists, to understand the mobility or lack thereof of the local population. And his research convinced him that, quote, social psychological explanations could not explain what was going on, at least not on their own. Yes, statistics showed that salaries were higher in the cities, as were other measures of material plenty standard that were used in the Soviet Union, such as the availability of consumer goods. But surveys also showed that people were generally happy with their material conditions in the countryside. And then, as he explained at this meeting in 1981, he said the standard of living in cities is lower than in rural areas. And it's not because the salaries are lower, but the overall level of material welfare is higher in the cities, is higher than in the cities if you include income from peasants' personal plots. Again, this information was not revealed by his surveys, but came from his own, quote, visual observations. I said the level of income from personal plots is higher than income from the formal sector. There's a powerful factor restraining the movement of the rural population. And so he argued against uncritically using concepts like tradition, as if tradition was not supported by social economic conditions of life. But where was he getting this information from? How did his visual observations translate into an estimate of relative income and material conditions? How could he formalize this information? Well, an important clue comes from an article he published summarizing this research in Sociological исследования in 1983. Once again, he tried to reconcile the survey results showing relatively high satisfaction with material conditions among rural residents with the data on income by pointing to the availability of private plots. But there's a very interesting moment in this article. The rest of this piece is filled with tables and figures drawn from the survey. But Zuzin only has one data point about the private plots. He refers to a, quote, accidental meeting with a Tajik agronomist who had established himself with a personal plot in the countryside. And according to Zuzin, this agronomist had, and then the numbers get very specific, 50 apple trees producing anywhere between 5 and 15 tons of apples a year, which the agronomist sold at 1 ruble per kilogram. This agronomist also kept cows and a sheep, which helped make the family self-sufficient in meat, milk, and wool. And even in a bad year, the agronomist could earn 5,000 rubles from his apples alone, while his yearly salary, as one of the most highly paid people in the farm, right, member of farm administration, was only 2,280 rubles. Now, an agronomist, of course, was not a typical member of a collective farm. As a member of farm's management, not only paid more than almost all the other members, but in a privileged position when it came to apportioning land, as well as securing supplies of water and fertilizer. But Zuzin apparently felt that the agronomist could stand in for a pattern he was observing more broadly. And one reason that he may have felt this way is that actually studying private plots was particularly challenging in a Soviet context. Officially, the size of these plots was limited, and peasants were supposed to sell part of their produce to the state or the collective farm and pay taxes on the produce they sold themselves. But there was therefore plenty of reason to doubt the data on plot size and incomes captured by official sources. In other words, plenty of reason to hide what you were growing and selling. Peasants were naturally reticent about sharing information about their private plots. One thing to say that you were content with material conditions in a survey, another to open up regarding the ways that those material conditions exceeded those reported to authorities. In other words, there was always crucial information that escaped both statistical research and surveys, no matter how complex the method. In this context, informal observations or anecdotal information could help a researcher explain an anomaly or at least provide some clues on how to restructure the research and look for that information. But the use of such information went against the trend of Soviet social science, which was instead turning to more sophisticated survey and mathematical models to answer questions about how people lived. Indeed, Zuzin's account is highly unusual for social science publications of the time. Having gone through all the issues of this journal, looking particularly at methodological pieces, it's striking how much time is spent on kind of refining the survey technique, refining the formulas, mathematical formulas that can be used to compute the results. The one exception to this I found is a study led by an Armenian sociologist, Gevorg Pogosyan, who defended his dissertation, I think, around this time in 1982 or so. Later went on to become an advisor to the president of Armenia. So this picture is from much later than his PhD years. But in a 1981 article, The Interviewer as a Source of Expert Information, he argued that sociologists were wrong to ignore the insights of those who actually went out to gather information. Remember, most of these projects are done in these huge teams where the lead researcher is not actually the one going out into the field, right? Usually they hire PhD students, undergraduates, and so on, who are given these very detailed instructions about how to collect information. As he put it, concerns with the reliability of information collected through standardized interviews was leading Soviet sociologists to turn to methods such as telephone and computer surveys. Yet in trying to eliminate the influence of the interviewer, the sociologist denies himself an important additional source of information of a methodological character. In his own research carried out among industrial workers in Yerevan, Pogosyan demonstrated that supplementary analysis of the interviewers who administered the surveys could help a researcher determine the reliability of answers provided. Now, of course, what Zuzin was doing in incorporating his accidental or serendipitous interview with a Tajik agronomist was a very different use of expertise than that suggested by Pogosyan, right? Pogosyan envisions the interviewer as an expert who can comment on the way people are responding to questions and assess the genuineness and spontaneity of their responses, thus giving the lead researcher an extra tool to assess the validity of a survey. But Zuzin relied on this Tajik agronomist as an expert, and curiously does not cite any of the other 300 experts that he supposedly interviewed as part of that project. He cites them to confirm his own quote-unquote visual observations, deviating not just from methodological standards, but apparently justified in terms of solving this puzzle. Now, if the informal observation or spontaneous exchange was to help plug this information gap, it was all the more important to have interviewers who could win over the trust of their respondents and who could provide the researchers with necessary information beyond what was picked up in the questionnaires and surveys. And this is where the young Central Asian specialists, usually graduate students working as part of a team, became particularly important. In Central Asia, economic sociology developed in parallel with the field's emergence in Russia. In Uzbekistan, by Lulaeva, contemporary of Zaslavskaya, I've written about it before, undertook the study of women's labor in collective farms for her dissertation in the early 1960s. And as she explained in the dissertation, statistical information that she found was not very helpful. So she went out to collective farms and training facilities to compensate for the lacunae in the statistical information. She talked to brigade leaders, farm management, women. What she found was that women were largely excluded from all management positions, as well as more skilled, as well as those requiring skilled labor, such as operating agricultural machinery. And what was worse, women who had completed professional education were mostly engaged in manual labor. And as a result, fewer women were then interested in taking advantage of educational opportunities. In the decades that followed, she became a specialist on women's labor, publishing frequently in Central Asian and all Soviet journals, authoring a number of books, and speaking also to international fora. And there are a number of people like this by the late 70s and 80s. Now, perestroika created new opportunities. Sociology gained new prestige and new freedoms. This is when Zaslavskaya really becomes famous. And in the Central Asian republics, where sociologists had continued to work within philosophy departments or institutes of economics, new initiatives were founded. In Tashkent, for example, a sociological laboratory is opened with the help of the State Universities Administration. And then international contexts open up further opportunities by 1989. In Moscow, there was a fund for cultural initiatives funded by George Soros and with Zaslavskaya as one of the leaders, which helps these laboratories acquire computers and then get access to training. The biggest puzzle that people were still working on, however, was this problem of immobility and standards of living more generally. And it's here that the interviewers as expert could really prove their worth, although how to integrate their observation into formalized findings remained a problem. The need to better understand the, quote, inexplicable behavior of Central Asian peasants helped drive the expansion of sociology in the Republic. But sociologists still faced problems answering the key questions that bothered planners. Was the explanation primarily cultural or economic, right? If it was cultural, then planners could say, well, these people don't fit into kind of Soviet historical categories, right? Nothing can be done. If they were economic, the problem was Soviet economic policy or the premises there. Right? Obviously, of course, these are not necessarily separable, but this is how this was sometimes debated. By this point, researchers had come to recognize that the family, the key unit for Zaslaska's studies of peasants in the Urals, was not the right unit for studying the Central Asian countryside. Teams of researchers working in state planning, or more concretely, the Council of Productive Forces within the state planning organizations, worked to compare cross-sections of income, including salaries and welfare payments, the structure and volume of consumption, and the level of development of social infrastructure. One researcher noted that while income was lowest in the Central Asian republics, if you compared families rather than individuals, the picture became very different. Suddenly, Turkmenistan moved to the top of the rankings from near the bottom, and Uzbekistan's collective farmers from 12th to 4th place. In other words, large families had multiple earners, and if they pooled their resources, the extended family was much better off. It turned out that rural Central Asians were less well off than urban Russians, but in many ways better off than urban working class Central Asians, and actually not so far behind better off peasants elsewhere in the USSR. But these studies led to further questions. Income from personal plots appeared to be among the lowest in the USSR as the size of land plots. But other studies noted that poorer families relied on those personal plots for up to 90% of their income. So these showed kind of an economic rationale for immobility, but could not account for informal or semi-formal activity, what sociologists at the time called the second economy. For example, personal plots in Central Asia were often used for fruits, including citrus fruits, that took up less space than potatoes or vegetables, but were in high demands throughout the USSR. By the 1970s, you had informal middlemen bringing such fruits to markets as far away as Moscow and Leningrad. But income from such sales was very hard to track. Even the timing of surveys could significantly affect outcomes because growing seasons varied enormously across the region and also depending on where you are in terms of elevation. And with growing seasons generally longer in Central Asia than in most parts of Russia or Ukraine, some farmers even managed to use collective farmlands to plant their own crops after the main crash crop, usually cotton, had been harvested. As one of the young sociologists who made his career in Tashkent during this period noted in an interview with me, his laboratory focused on studying household budgets, but weren't sure how to go about this because a family could be split into several households, but a household could be more than one family, and the state kind of statistical information was not very useful. So they tried different kind of approaches using spending diaries and interviews, but what they found was that spending did not match income. As he put it, we couldn't explain this discrepancy between income and expenditures, but got the feeling that something was underreported by the observed households. It wasn't necessarily because the households deliberately hid information about their income, but there might have been some aspects of their informal transactions that were difficult to report by answering the interview questions. Nevertheless, it led them to conclude that the collective farm was an important part of the informal economy. Collective farmlands were used for a second harvest in the late autumn, or could be used as an extension of private land. Not everyone was equally positioned to take advantage of these possibilities, of course. For example, brigade leaders could make arrangements with farm administrations that benefited their extended family. Nevertheless, together, these kinds of observations began to change how Soviet planners thought of the personal plot in general and in Central Asia in particular. In the late 80s, the Soviet Union tried to increase productivity, agricultural productivity, by introducing a family brigade or family subcontracting system, under which a family could contract with a collective farm to cultivate a certain acreage of land, with a given crop and be paid as a unit. And it would also be allowed to hire additional laborers to help so long as they were related. And the idea was then to kind of increase productivity by introducing a profit motive. What's interesting about this initiative, however, is that it reorients economic activity around the family, but also reflects observations about family structures in Central Asia in particular. When you see discussions about this, they actually state this openly sometimes, right? They say the Russian countryside substantially emptied out, farm labor had become feminized, but in Central Asia, officials noted that better off families were the ones that earned substantial incomes from their own activity. As one specialist at a roundtable said, this might not work in Russia and Ukraine, but Central Asians had maintained their traditions of family organization of production, which meant that they could take advantage of these initiatives. And officials in Central Asia also hoped that this would be a way to kind of get Central Asia beyond kind of off of the cotton monoculture. And they threw out really interesting numbers that started appearing in the Central Asian press and in all Soviet discussion in the late 80s. For example, that personal plots only cover 3% of the republic's territory, but produce a quarter of its agricultural products. Or in Tajikistan, they use only 6% of irrigated land, but produce 40% of food supplies. And these kind of numbers are thrown around with a lot of certainty in the late 80s, but I think they're as good as made up. As we've seen by the late 80s, many researchers understood that private plots were not limited to the land registered as such, but the collective farm and reported to administrations. But there was no way to actually capture the volume of grown crops on these plots and sold within the Republic. Rather, despite the contradictory evidence on the private farm plots, social scientists and planners had just become convinced that these plots helped explain not just the relative inability of Central Asian peasants, but also how to move forward in terms of raising standards of living in the countryside and increasing agricultural productivity. So it's not the increasingly sophisticated research methods, but rather the gaps in knowledge revealed by that research, along with the observations made by those researchers and their teams, that led social scientists and planners to the conclusion. And again, equally important is who is in a position to make these observations. And this is where these young Central Asian sociologists play such an important role. They're particularly well positioned to make those observations, right? And speak with authority about what they see once they're being listened to, because they're the ones who actually spend time in the areas they were studying, often eating with their subjects or investigation and being housed by them. Even if they were not senior enough, such as if they were not by the Laiva, they could pass that information on to the researchers they worked for, who in turn amplified those observations and made them a social fact. Now, getting to the kind of post-Soviet period. If perestroika opened up new opportunities for younger sociologists, the Soviet collapse really scrambled things, because on the one hand, the collapse of state funding meant that one couldn't really earn a living wage with academic work anymore. And in Central Asia, as elsewhere, scholars struggled to survive, working odd jobs to supplement their very meager incomes. But there were also opportunities. First, post-Soviet governments began to put their limited resources into new institutions meant to provide policy-relevant research. There are these centers for strategic research that pop up in a lot of the post-Soviet states. And then in organizations like the Center for Public Opinion and the Center for Economic Development, which both get contracts from the state, but also from international organizations. And Budulaeva goes on to this Ijtimoiy Fikr, which is the Republican Center for the Study of Public Opinion, and basically leads it for most of the 90s and 2000s. The other is that foreign scholars backed by grants from international organizations began to set up projects around the Soviet Union in the years leading up to collapse. Most notable among those was Theodore Shanin, a name that might be familiar to some of you. And then third, that international development agencies turned to these local experts to conduct their own research. And they sought out younger scholars, particularly ones with a knowledge of English, to help them interpret countries of which they had very little understanding. And these younger scholars were best positioned to take advantage of study opportunities offered by international organizations and donors, as well as to use their newfound skills to attract more contracts. And in part to work with these funders and fulfill their contracting requirements, younger scholars began to set up independent commercial research centers, drawing on their networks in academia to do so. So this new situation scrambled the kind of older academic hierarchies. A lot of the older academic institutes lost their prestige and even their monopoly on credentialing, and they were rarely able to secure contracts independently. Instead, it was the newer organizations that were getting resources and providing policy advice, both to national governments and international organizations. To give you just two examples, in Uzbekistan, one of the younger sociologists who I've been talking about started a center called Expert, which began getting contracts from the World Bank and others. And he brought in kind of people from his PhD cohort to help him kind of run this thing. Others found a way to straddle two worlds. It's interesting. Some of these people who start new centers, they very much define themselves against this older generation, especially against the people who go and work for post-Soviet government-affiliated institutes. Others very much kind of straddle two worlds. So in Tajikistan, a former translator who had worked in Afghanistan and was a graduate of the Moscow Institute of Oriental Studies, had begun writing on Central Asian affairs in the late Soviet period. He and his wife founded a research center called Shark. At the same time, which means East, he continued as head of sector within one of the academic institutes and used his connections in the center as well as his position as head of a kind of private research center to get contacts with the UNDP. And kind of draw in both the kind of those older academics as well as younger people like himself. These scholars were very important for international organizations and especially for understanding poverty, the livelihoods of rural populations, their survival strategies, and then ways of acting on poverty. Not only were they well placed to organize the logistics of this kind of research, which again involved kind of large research teams spread out across several regions a lot of the time. Their experience conducting analogous research and the ability to help international organizations and specialists see problems in their methodology. Important here is that in the 90s, international organizations had, like the World Bank, had instituted a number of practices in response to criticism of international development voiced in the 90s, right? Namely that development plans ignored the voices of those they were supposed to benefit. So the World Bank institutes this research program called Consultations with the Poor to inform its World Development Report, which was called a comparative research effort using participatory methods to focus on the voices of the poor. And in Uzbekistan, the research was contracted to the expert team, whose leadership then wrote the report. Another example of this is the work of the sociologist Denis Kandioti, who'd previously written on gender and the Middle East, but had begun to work on Central Asia in the 90s. And working with a team of local researchers, she undertook a project for the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development to evaluate household expenditures and livelihood strategies in rural Uzbekistan. But her experiences in the field and her conversation with the interviewers, the researchers on her team, reveal a number of flaws in the UN's approach, namely that the assumptions of the surveys fit neither the variety of practices used across the country, nor the way that respondents understood the categories that were presented to them, right? So again, these kind of international organizations faced a very similar problem to those bedeviling Soviet planners. And again, it was the kind of these researchers who were kind of intermediary in this chain who were crucial in terms of raising these methodological problems and getting them to see another kind of truth. Okay, so to sum up, in her work on Kyrgyzstani sociologists, Sarah Amsler writes that empiricism, to which these scholars claim to be committed after the Soviet period, was a challenge to ideologize social science, right? A response to what they saw as kind of the problems of social science under Marxism and Leninism. But I think what really shook things up and what really raised the status of these individuals was not simply the ability to execute empirical research and to claim objectivity, but actually to explain how things really worked from their own position, right? To point to the things that the research could not capture. Bernard Cohn described a system that was gaining confidence in its ability to rule over populations and not coincidentally to rule over its home population as well as more distant and colonized ones. Right? And as it does so, it kind of discards the intermediaries that it needs in an earlier period. But what I describe is happening in a moment where the Soviet system is actually losing confidence in itself and where this is part of that process. If anything, it accelerates that process, right? The idea that you can have this kind of planning system which knows its population, can measure all of these things about it, and based on that, act. And, you know, not coincidentally, it's also a moment of kind of crisis in international development too. But the third point I want to make is that this is cyclical, right? It's not that we had kind of one way of doing things and then we had this kind of problem and then we moved on to something else. Really, I think what we're seeing here is a kind of cycle, which, you know, I haven't been able to fully kind of theorize or articulate yet, but where these systems of governance, these systems of development go from seeking increasing complexity to simplicity and then kind of go back outwards again, right? So if we look at the kind of studies of the kind of sociology I was describing now, right, where these kind of rural surveys get ever more complex, or the attempt to study standards of living across the Soviet Union, which I found, I write about this elsewhere, seem to have involved something like 400, 500, or 600, nobody actually knows the number, different research institutes at one point, right? But kept coming up with kind of new problems and things that didn't make sense. And eventually, of course, you abandon it and you go for something simple. Aha, you know, the private pot, that's where everything is, right? So you scrap the 600 research institutes, you go to your solution. And then there are other things you can't explain and you go back out towards complexity and back. So these are the kind of things that I'm trying to think about when not thinking about Ukraine, and be happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much, Artemy, for this education. Now we have both a virtual and an in-person audience, and the virtual one, you know, you can, if you prefer, just type your question, or maybe even better, you can raise your hand.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Nikolai. I'm a postdoc at NYU. Thank you for this fantastic talk. It's very insightful. Really interesting story about this urban economic sociologists, and I think we don't know enough about this. And I was thinking of this sociology in the global context of the development, yes, and urban development. And of course, if you think of the history of urban development in capitalist countries, yes, in the 60s it becomes rather a history of the critiques, yeah, of the development, like Jane Jacobs and Riley Fever, yes, and they seem to become much more influential than the planners themselves in critiquing this modernist urban planning, and actually leading to a new paradigm of more individualistic, kind of postmodernist. And this is a process which was not, I think, well described in Soviet context. So was the part of this process of reconsideration of the functionalist planning, which was also going on in the in Soviet context, and in general, what was the influence of these scholars? So were they still the marginal voices, or was it a part of the mainstream? Because he also mentioned this experts who used this mathematical language, yes. And I was looking at urban development a bit, and that was also striking. You open one book and you will see only formulas there, or sometimes very these attempts to make interviews and so on. So was it, should you think of this group of experts as oppositions, as being in opposition, or was it the same process of the discussion of the development of the cities?
It's part of one larger discussion. I mean, in Central Asia, I wrote about this a bit in the last book, right? But as part of this discussion about why people don't move, aside from what's keeping them in the rural regions. There's also a discussion of what's wrong with the cities. So there is this kind of pretty big discussion in the 1980s about, what are the ways in which these cities are not attractive to the people they're supposed to be, for, right? So why is is Dushanbe really a Tajik capital, or is it just a Russian city in Central Asia? Same thing for Tashkent and so on. The way that people answer that question varies, right? So for some people, especially in the very late 1980s, it is all about kind of the architecture, right? And not just in the late 80s, I mean, in the 70s, there's already a kind of discussion about this, right? So the architecture doesn't actually reflect national traditions, right? It doesn't actually combine the modern with the traditional in the way that, Soviet architecture should, right? Or Soviet urban planning. For some, it's more symbolic. It's more about, we need to have more kind of Central Asian heroes celebrated in the cities and so on. There are interesting kind of architectural attempts to deal with this, right? So the most famous one is in Tashkent. You have the virtual mahalla, right, which tries to kind of combine the more traditional Central Asian urban house and the kind of way that it's modular, so that it can expand and contract depending on the size of the family into a vertical building. But that doesn't work very well with Soviet mass production, right? So if on the one hand you don't have enough housing, you want to build kind of the more standard stuff as quickly as possible. But if the problem is that nobody wants the standard stuff, then of course you build the other one. So they never kind of figure out how to do that. I think, I hesitate to kind of call the people I'm studying marginal in a sense, because, they're listened to when what they're studying, answers a need, right? So, Vaidulaiva already in the 70s is a very prominent person, right? She's in Uzbek academia, first of all, but she's publishing in central journals. She's being sent to all these international councils, and she's often speaking against, challenging a lot of the premises of what central planning is saying, and what her male colleagues in Central Asia are saying, what some of the more, the economists who are more committed to kind of industrialization are saying. So I think part of it is, of course, that the Soviet system, it does, give room for quite a bit of debate. But I think these particular voices become more important because they're dealing with an issue that just they can't find an explanation for, right? And so then they become more than just not marginalized. They are suddenly the ones who have an answer. Right. And then especially in the post-Soviet period, right, then there are several things which make them the go-to kind of people rather than their own, PhD supervisors in most of these cases. Yeah.
So I don't know if we have one from that.
No, we don't.
No, okay. So I have two questions, and they might be both unfair and not, but I perhaps not what you need, but I'm gonna pose them, and maybe I just missed some. I'm framing this all wrong. Both of the questions are about specificity.
Mm-hmm.
And one is coming from the fact that I was teaching collectivization yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And so reading a lot about survey data, in fact, in Sarah Cameron's book,
Mm-hmm.
About Kazakhstan,
Mm-hmm.
and about understanding the quantities of livestock who were available and how they're trying to gather this information.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose I was very struck at the end just now how you characterized this moment as, the moment of losing hope in a reconsideration of functionalist planning and of the promise that with better information we will achieve better outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems, in the beginning part of your talk, you were saying that, in contrast to Cohn, one of the things that is happening in the Soviet case is that the increased complexity of the tools was not leading to greater power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could, or if you had thoughts about the ways in which, was this a realization that each generation had to come to for itself? Or was there something that was happening at this moment that we would characterize as being different from previous encounters with the limits of the knowledge generation project.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I apologize if I just simply missed.
No.
that moment.
I think that's a really good point. I think the Sarah Cameron book is kind of an excellent illustration, even though I'm not working on Kazakhstan specifically. But in a way, right? You know, scholars who've looked at the Kazakh famine going back to the 1920s would point out, like, first there's this kind of attempt to better understand, you know, what is this nomadic lifestyle? How does this work? Et cetera. You get all this information, but then what happens during collectivization is that this all goes out the window, and they just say, just do this, right? And that's what Stalinism is to some extent, right? It's you know, yes, we have all this attempt.
Not just do this, but I think one of the things that was striking that we were thinking about yesterday that she's describing is that they're saying, no, in fact, there are large numbers of livestock there that we're missing because our information is bad.
Right, that as well. But yeah, so one of this is we can't actually have all that information we need, but at the same time, I also discussed this with students recently, so it's also been on my mind in a slightly different way, but also, you know, the scholars who are saying, actually, you can't just go ahead and do the systematization thing, because the way that, you know, the size of these herds works is quite complex, et cetera, right? And then the revival of social science after Stalinism is partially a response to the failures of Stalinism and an attempt to say, you know, if we only had better information, then Soviets, you know, then planning could work, right? So then you have the right. So you build it, and then again you have this now, but it's a very different loss of confidence, obviously, in the 80s than it is in the 30s, right? In the 30s, it's, you know, it's partially impatience and partially fear of war and whatever. And in the 80s, it's something else, right? It's okay, we've been trying this better planning through science thing for a long time, and it's not actually giving us what we need, right? We don't even know how many institutes we have studying these questions anymore. So that's what I mean by you know, it being cyclical, right? And it's not necessarily
cyclical, but without the same impact at each moment.
Right. Yeah, cyclical, but of course always, you know, contingent, and yeah.
Okay, well, you know, I hope that we do have actually a question from the online audience. Faruk Kuziev.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, it's already late at night here in Budapest. Nice to see you, and thank you for the great talk. It will definitely help me a lot in my research. Just maybe one point that is not a question. It's, are you sure that this the failure to move rural population to the cities was never intended? I read a lot of Khrushchev, the guilty pleasure. So even already in 1952, that was an intended program for the Soviet economic planning to actually keep rural population in place, but to urbanize them where they are. So there was this idea of agrogoroda, yes, agricultural cities, which would contain all of the elements of the urban infrastructure already there, so that this gap between the rural and urban population is closed, yes, and it will be the Marxist prophecy fulfilled. But also, I was just wondering, what kind of larger conclusions can we make out of this failure to understand and know the object of study? It seems to me that the people, the rural people, yes, they're either wealthy, and that's a problem. They're poor, and that's also a problem. And I just have an impression, I don't know how to also to articulate it. There is just this object of study that is evasive, that does not want to be understood. And can we think of it as some kind of a anti-colonial ethos behavior, unconscious response, something from Michel Desserteau, yes? When we resist, we don't always realize that we're doing so, and maybe that could also be the case. I'm just merely speculating, maybe hallucinating, but thank you again for the talk. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you for great questions. On the failure to move the rural population isn't intended. I mean, it depends on where we're looking, right? So in a large sense, I think the challenge of planners in the second half, after the 50s at least, is, the countryside in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus is emptying out, but the countryside in Central Asia and to a lesser extent the Caucasus is overpopulated. This is how they talk about it all of the time. Now, how you deal with that, varies, right? And what you should do. In the planners looking at Central Asia, on the one hand, they say, look, we have this great potential labor force. If only we could get them to move into industry, we could use them in Central Asian cities. We could use them in Siberia, where we're trying to build all these industries and so forth. So if they're actually intending to keep them in the countryside, it's like the weirdest conspiracy I've ever seen, because they invest an enormous amount of resources into trying to figure out how to get them to move. But they also have a lot of debate among themselves about where they should move, right? Does that mean, primarily larger cities within Central Asia itself? Does that mean, wherever the industry already is around the Soviet Union? Does that mean building smaller industrial cities within Central Asia because those are closer to where people are from? And it's interesting, right? Every time they think they found a solution, they get some information that undermines it, right? At one point, I think in the 70s, they kind of hit on this idea, well, okay, people don't seem to want to move to the big cities, but if we build smaller industrial cities closer to where they're from, that's where they'll move to. But then that doesn't work. And when they do surveys, it turns out that people who want to move to the biggest cities because that's prestigious. And the standard of living there is higher in certain ways, but nobody actually wants to move to those smaller kind of industrial towns. So, it's more of these kind of, they have kind of the big paradigm, right? Which is some people are going to have to move, but also, yes, the countryside is going to have to become more like the city in terms of services, et cetera, et cetera. They debate also about what comes first, right? Do you first raise the standard of living in the countryside and then people are more ready for industrial modernity, or vice versa? But I think the bigger paradigm is they do want Central Asians to move. And there's people who don't give up on that until 1991, including a lot of Central Asian economists. The evasive object of study, yes, but in some ways I think it's more complex, because what you see in these stories, and again, some of them I'm getting through oral history, is that they're evasive when they're faced with the kind of standardized questionnaire, right? And when that questionnaire is pushed aside, a lot of times they basically say, listen, I'll tell you how it really works, to the same person, right? So there is a kind of evasion. There is a kind of resistance to being categorized in a particular way, to being recorded in a particular way, but not necessarily to being understood, right? And so I think that it's a little bit more complex than that, right? I mean, if you do oral history, right, you'll always be told, don't go in with a standardized questionnaire, right? And anybody who's done oral history knows that that's not going to work. Instead, what you try to do is have a large framework and then have a conversation with somebody. And it seems to be a kind of similar process here, right? But I hesitate to say, no, they just don't want to be known. They don't want to be understood. Because they're nevertheless the ones who are giving the information that challenges, the presumptions that go into that questionnaire, that go into that survey work. So.
Wonderful. Masha Salaskin, next questionnaire.
Hello, and thank you so much for this great talk. I actually have two questions. One is a conceptual one that really builds in a slightly different way on Farukh's question, and then a more historically specific question about discourses in the 70s and 80s. So I'll start with the conceptual question, and feel free to disregard it if it doesn't speak to you. But one way that I really appreciated your talk is in its mirroring of the question of informal economy or informal culture more broadly, and then the kind of epistemology or the formal methods of informal investigation, right? And I'm always struck by how this very notion of the informal, right, again, culture, economy, exchange, circulation, has really, especially recently, become a way to understand both the late Soviet period and the global South during the same period, right? And then, you know, especially in the studies of the global South, this move from the understanding of informal to something like multitudes, right? And people like Dilip Gaonkar and Ravi Sanduram write about it. So they understand that what they call sort of post-colonial piracy, or the culture of post-colonial piracy that relies on informal economies and means of exchange and circulation and reproduction, as a way of empowering a different kind of collectivity, right? Very much sort of post-Marxian, much more rooted in a kind of subaltern notions, or, you know, notions of multitude, right? And so I often think about how to map this conceptual development onto an obviously equally important historically, discursively, and culturally notion of, again, the informal within the late Soviet period, right? So I was just curious, and again, how do we conceptualize the people? So in that sense, it ties to Farouk's question, right? Like, so how do we think of these people as both the objects of study and as potential agents of power, right? Vis-a-vis the kind of more traditional Marxist categories that obviously the Soviet economists and even sociologists are struggling with, right? So that's the kind of conceptual question, just wondering your thoughts on this. And again, sort of what that would mean in terms of actually our scholarly position in doing comparative work, especially vis-a-vis, let's say, history of Central Asia in relation to histories of development of the global South. And the specific historical question has to do with the so-called demographic crisis that is, so coming from the study of gender, for example, exactly the same period. So as the 70s go on and the 80s, there's a kind of a hysteria over the discourse of demographic crisis with regards to the low birth rate in the western part of Soviet Union and the high rate of birth rate in the Eastern and Southern republics, and the labor shortages that both are seen as responsible for or potentially gonna cause, right? Because even in the case of Central Asia, there's this discourse that, as actually tapping into exactly what you were saying, the larger family and women's role outside of the labor force actually ends up leading to potential, at least, or actual labor shortages there. And the way that that is addressed, even though it's pressed as an economic issue, and that's one of the reasons why there's a kind of hysteria over it. But then very quickly, at least in the works of sociologists and sort of pedagogical studies, is that there's a consensus that economic factors seem to have largely failed to address this demographic crisis. And so we need to move to questions of ideology, and that's, you know, how we get an increasingly sort of traditional gender discourses in the course of the 70s and 80s. And so I was wondering in your research whether these things were separate for the scholars that you're looking at, since it is a different branch, right? And these are economic sociologists, or whether this enters into those discussions. Because again, in some ways, on the level of method, it seems like some of the tensions are the same, right? You know, do we deal with economic ways of motivation and shifting, you know, this phenomena, or is this a cultural issue, and therefore we need to increase our sort of educational and ideological efforts? Thank you. I know it's a lot, so just, you know, any of it which resonates, I would love to hear your thoughts on
No, it all resonates, and they're great questions. Let me take the second one first, because it's more, as you said, it's almost more of an empirical question. It comes up all the time, right? So I'm taking a very specific kind of sliver to illustrate my points in this paper, but there's another paper which I've written which focuses on the idea of home labor for women, which again is a project all across the Soviet Union, but it's particularly promoted in Central Asia because women are not entering the labor force, and you want to raise standards of living, and then you discover that they have these traditional ways of doing things. So you think about how to integrate it into the socialist economy, and then in the late 80s, you start reimagining those women as like almost entrepreneurs, and then international organizations come in and think about this in terms of promoting livelihoods or even women's entrepreneurialism. But that also gets into these debates about demography, right? And in Central Asia, those debates are very fraught in the 80s because you have one camp that's basically saying, this large population that we have, that's our kind of key to making a big jump into industrial modernity and into industrialization. So we should kind of keep encouraging people to have children, but we need to do better in terms of getting those children ready for the industrial workforce. And then there's another group that says, actually, one of the reasons we have low standards of living is because we have so many people, basically too many people to share the economic pie. And so what we need to do is actually encourage Central Asian families to have fewer children, right? And it's not that Russians are saying Central Asians need to have fewer babies and Central Asians are saying more. It's actually much more scrambled than that, right? The ones who are the most passionate about saying Central Asians should have smaller families that I found are Central Asian scholars, coming from different fields, maternal health, economics, sociology. And Soviet scholars, to give them credit, most of them actually don't make a clear separation between cultural factors and economic factors. I mean, in that sense, they do have a good Marxist training, right? They realize that these things are connected. The question is to figure out how they're connected, right? So even these economists who are, studying why people don't move are saying things like, well, maybe what we should focus on first is increasing the level of education and services in the countryside, which will free up women, which will integrate people, more into Soviet society, et cetera, and then they'll be willing to move, right? So, in that sense, they're actually fairly nuanced. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I mean, there's a lot of kind of specifics we can go into, but that's the kind of bigger picture. So it's always, even in these discussions about the labor plot, the personal plots, it's very much there. Oh, and one of the reasons it's controversial, by the way, one of the reasons a lot of Central Asian economists actually oppose these reforms is because they say these are going to kind of perpetuate the traditional family that they've been fighting against. Right, so they basically say, okay, if you have women producing in the home, she's going to employ her own children, right? And then they're not going to be going to school, and then et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with the perfect plot. They're like, you're just closing the family in, and you can forget about the rest of the Soviet kind of modernization project. Now, the bigger conceptual question, I think, is also really interesting, right? I mean, partially, of course, informal economies, whatever doesn't fit into the way we tax or the way we study people's economic behavior, right? Everything that doesn't fit into that becomes the informal economy. I hesitate to use that term too much for the Soviet case, in part because that's not the term that was used for most of the Soviet period, right? In fact, one of the problems is that Soviet scholars almost don't talk about it at all, right? If you want to look for information about what we would call the second economy, you can't look in Soviet economic journals until the very, very late Soviet period. You will only find it in like dissertations from criminal law, right? Who will talk about how you battle that, right? This is one of the problems with trying to study something like private plots. You pretend it doesn't exist, right? And then you don't have to treat this problem of a second economy, formal economy, right? To some extent, the title of this talk was just a pun on Bernard Cohn's book, right? And then the links between the object and then the form of investigation. I think this is a process, like Timothy Mitchell kind of argues that economists kind of create the economy, which I think might be taking things a little bit too far, but in a way, these are mutually related processes, right? You recognize that you see that there's something there that you're not observing. You try to integrate that into your models, and particularly in a kind of Soviet system, you also then try to create a space for that, or you try to promote it if you think it's useful. And so by studying it, you also are kind of recreating or creating it. But those models, of course, never capture the complexity of what's actually going on, right? And the other reason I hesitate to use this term and make direct comparisons with other post-colonial situations is because the things like the private plot are very much tied into the formal economy, right? Like, where does the private plot get water? Where does it get the successful private farmer? Where's that private farmer getting water? Where's that private farmer getting fertilizer, right? What are the tools that are being used to market this produce? All of that is connected to the second economy. And that's what I think Lasker was already starting to understand in the 60s, even looking at the Ural Mountains. But I think it goes much deeper than what she outlined at the time. And I think it also partially helps explain why you have such a downturn in the 1990s. Because when the formal economy collapses, then the so-called informal economy doesn't rise up to replace it. It actually ends up collapsing with it.
Fantastic. Trying to go on Russian juggle, but maybe the other
The real one or the avatar?
The virtual one. But when I was finishing my book, I also got to spend a little bit of time in some research institutes. These are very specific, for Oriental studies, African, Asian, Moscow State University. And these were all Moscow-based institutions. And then in particular, the literary and cultural sections, where the overwhelming feeling was one of, absolute degradation of our knowledge. The sector of literature to the East, which used to employ 40 people in 1990, was now down to 8. Nobody was interested in this kind of scholarship or translation, which they felt used to be once world leading, but that is now really finding itself without any audience. And that was a little, positively surprised to hear that some of your experts were doing a lot better, even if, whether in a more subservient function as providers of local knowledge to foreign agencies, or, as important government, advisors. I forget the trajectory of that particular that woman that you. But I first wonder whether during in the 70s and 80s, your scholars were part of an international conversation on development, and so maybe going back to your book. And secondly, if you have a sense of the variety of trajectories, professional trajectories they have.
Yeah, so in terms of being part of an international conversation, I did talk a bit about that in the second book, but I'm still studying it, and part of the problem is that you can see where people go, you can see where they appear and who they talk to, but it's very hard when you're studying kind of Soviet scholarship to see where they're really impacted, right? Because there are costs to saying, oh, I got this idea from a scientist in the West. In fact, I've got a paper coming out where this costs a very, very senior person their career, or helped cost them their career, because they started using this phrase regional economics, which was developed by the kind of field of regional economics was developed by a Temple University graduate, Walter Hazard, whose textbook got translated into Russian in the 60s. and had this kind of big influence. But then, you know, when this guy made a few enemies, this was one of the things they used against him, right? You're just using this Western scholars kind of ideas, right? So even if you're impacted, there's a kind of, you know, there's a good reason not to scream about it. The only time I've ever been able to kind of really show that there was a influence from outside is where people told me in oral history situations, like, oh yes, I was there, I heard this, it affected how I studied things because I then started doing this. But in terms of tracing where people go, yeah, and actually getting out of Soviet archives and looking at UN archives, ILO archives has been really useful for this, right? Because then I find people like Ubaydullayeva, you know, popping up at a seminar with the UN in like 1978, 1983, et cetera, right? So you know that they know what's going on. People know who they are. It's not surprising that when the UN or other organizations come in the 90s, they find these people because, you know, they've been on their radar before that. And so that gets into your second question, which is the variety of career trajectories. And I think, at least for the social scientists, I mean, there's several things that happen. One is that this category of economist sociologists largely disappears. So a lot of people who had primarily called themselves economists are calling themselves sociologists in the 90s, like Ubaydullayeva, in part because then they can work with these international organizations. But Soviet economics is so discredited that, you know, unless you're one of the kind of Gaidar type reformers, being an economist just isn't very helpful anymore. And the ones who really insist, no, I'm an economist, they tend to kind of stay in, you know, government affiliated institutions. And, you know, they still kind of teach and occasionally they might, and that this is the irony, right? It's usually then through their students that they end up getting contracts to do research for international organizations, right? But in a way, their own status is then partially, at least, reduced. You know, some people, especially who are younger, go into the private sector and manage to find work there, but not really as research economists anymore. And then there's the younger group who work for organizations like the World Bank will then sometimes be